What is going on, everybody? This is Andrew from DeFiancy. All right, guys, we are at the end of the session for the stock market today, and we are currently looking at Bitcoin. I want to talk a lot about Bitcoin. Today's been a pretty nice day for Bitcoin. It has retraced most of the large move that occurred yesterday. So there was a fake, well, I say it's not fake, but there was an opinion from I guess they're like a research firm. I'm not really sure exactly what Matrixport is, but it's some kind of investment firm potentially who came out and with an article basically outlining why the Bitcoin Spot ETF will be rejected. And this is really kind of funny because it's just one entity's opinion. And the market absolutely did not like that. Immediately after that started getting retweeted, you had a huge move, about a 10% move down. And it just goes to show you just how flaky the market can really be when you have a lot of leverage built up. But overall, this is actually very beneficial for the price going forward. The fact that you just wiped out all of that leverage. And I think also something to mention is just how big of a move you got on these altcoins. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just find this fascinating. If you look at like Arbitrum, for example, it's already retraced this move that happened yesterday, but let me just show you how big of a move this was. So you had that headline came out about right here. So you had about a 25% move that got immediately bought up, and now you are from the bottom of that up about 40%. Just wild stuff here on altcoins. That's Arbitrum if you don't know what that is. It's a layer 2 governance token. But here's Bitcoin getting back up to its high about where it started to drop off at, going into the approval, which is likely tomorrow or Monday. And I have a few different thoughts on this. Typically speaking, when you have an event like this, it is usually a sell the news event, meaning a lot of people buy in anticipation for it. So for example, for Bitcoin, they bought down here, all throughout here really, especially down here. And you would think, just kind of like naturally, typically this kind of event would have some kind of selling after the news is actually realized. Now, this feels like it could potentially be a little bit different, and I'll be honest, it has surprised me that we haven't seen much selling yet in Bitcoin. You would think as we approach that approval that people would start to unload profits, but we're just not seeing it. In fact, we're just printing this pattern that we had here. Remember we talked about in a few videos ago how that's like this just super immaculate accumulation. It's like the most bullish thing you can really have when it comes to an uptrending asset is further accumulation while it's going up. Well, that looks like that's exactly what's happening here. Is you're just getting this accumulation. It's a little bit more sideways, but that is showing you that people are still buying here, and you just bounce right off of this support level yesterday when you had that I won't call it fake news, but the stupid opinion piece from that firm. And now we're all the way back up. This to me is going to break to the upside. And the question I have is, how much longer is it going to stay sideways? Could we have a sell the news event tomorrow or Monday? Yes. But in either scenario, I don't see how this doesn't trade higher, mainly because the ETF is not priced in necessarily. Like a lot of people will say, well, it's been priced in. I don't really know how that's possible considering it's totally speculation in terms of how much capital is going to flow into that ETF over the next, let's say 6 months. We really don't know, but it's not crazy to assume that you're going to have substantially more demand than you've ever had, and there's only so much supply, right? So that's kind of Bitcoin has always had its supply situation is kind of a double-edged sword. When there's not a lot of demand, there's no narrative, Bitcoin can have pretty big drops. That's why it's very volatile on the high time frame. But when there's demand, when there's a narrative, this asset does very well. And I think we need to start focusing our attention on what is the narrative after the ETF. Okay. And if you can recall some of the videos we have made in the past, we've talked about how global liquidity is on the upswing. Okay. We've talked about that, and it's really important to understand really what that actually means in conjunction with a few other variables, namely monetary inflation. So we talked about this in another video about how gold and Bitcoin are kind of uniquely positioned to do well over the next decade because the United States has such a big debt issue. There's so much debt that needs to be reserved. We have to pay money on that debt, and the only way to pay money on that debt, the interest payments on that debt, is to actually unironically print more money. So this is just kind of like this positive feedback. Some people call that a death spiral potentially, but regardless of how it plays out, more money will need to be printed to keep the economy going and to reservice that debt. And that is only beneficial to Bitcoin, which is a scarce asset. There's only 21 million Bitcoin, and there's only so much gold on the planet. And I think stocks actually do well in that kind of regime as well, but stocks are a little bit more speculative, right? Because you have earnings that you have to deal with every quarter that could dramatically change people's attitude towards them. Whereas Bitcoin, it just doesn't have any kind of earnings. It doesn't have any CEO or anything that you would, it just doesn't have the typical risk vectors that stocks have. And I think this is just starting to be understood by the market, starting to be understood by people on Wall Street, that this is really a digital gold, and gold in general is going to be going up a lot as we keep inflating the currency supply. So that's the next narrative. And that's always actually been Bitcoin's narrative, is that it is an inflation hedge. Now, but it's not a monetary inflation hedge is not the same thing as a CPI inflation hedge. See, Bitcoin didn't go up when CPI was going up because people anticipated that rates would need to be increased. And we could go into that, but it's important to know that Bitcoin is actually a monetary inflation hedge, meaning it is a hedge against monetary debasement. So the Federal Reserve debasing the dollar in order to pay for the debt, namely, but also just to keep the economy going. It seems like we have these stimulus packages every other year now, and that's kind of the theme I'm saying that is going to be going. That's what people that are putting money into crypto, this is really what they're going to be leaning on, is that narrative, and that's a big narrative. And it happens to be that we have a halving year, right? So we already have a narrative going into April and beyond. If you don't know what the halving is, that's when the supply is cut in half. Or, I'm sorry, the amount of tokens being introduced into the supply, so the issuance of, I say tokens, but Bitcoin, it's not a token. The amount of coins being distributed into the market is cut in half. Okay, so this is a big deal in terms of supply and demand. Assuming that you have this demand, in terms of this monetary debasement narrative, and you have the issuance being cut in half, that's potentially a pretty explosive set of variables there. So there's a lot to look forward to. This is a very good environment for Bitcoin, but also crypto in general. Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about ETH here because we know that Bitcoin looks great. It's been performing really well versus ETH. But why is ETH not doing so well? And this one has actually scratched my head quite a bit. But I think I've really I think I have some answers for why it has underperformed most of the crypto market, but namely Bitcoin. And the reason why I think that it has underperformed Bitcoin, and here's your ETHBTC chart here. So this is ETH versus Bitcoin. Right now, it's down about 40% versus Bitcoin from the highs. The reason why I think this is obviously because the Bitcoin ETF is a Bitcoin ETF. It's not an ETH ETF. But I also think that ETH is now competing with other layer ones, meaning we know that Bitcoin doesn't really have a competitor. It's Bitcoin and then pretty much no one else. There is no, it doesn't really have anything else that has been created yet that people legitimately think is a competitor to Bitcoin. Now, I would make the case that ETH is actually a competitor to Bitcoin, but apparently the market does not believe that yet. I think that will be the case later on, because I think ETH has some unique properties that actually make it an even better monetary debasement hedge. But maybe that's another video we'll go into. The market does not think that right now. What it's looking at ETH or how it's viewing ETH, I think, is it's more speculative. It has competitors like Solana and Avalanche and other layer ones. It has a bunch of upgrades, and maybe things can go wrong. So people see it as more risky. It doesn't have the ETF yet, and it has a lot of competitors. So I think this has been kind of weighing on it. Not to mention, and this might be even more important than that in the short term, is that it has had a big supply overhang from bankrupt crypto companies like Celsius they've been selling their ETH in order to pay for things that they're doing. So there's been some big, large crypto companies that have been selling a lot of ETH. So that might be why it's been heavy. Now the question is this going to turn around? Is ETH going to just continue to go down versus Bitcoin, or is it going to turn around? Because I think this is very important for traders and investors to really understand, because if ETH does really start to gain narrative, it's going to outperform Bitcoin significantly from here, in my opinion. Now, we have to also, we talked about this earlier, but Bitcoin's going to have the ETF. You're going to have all these firms that has never bought Bitcoin. They're going to be buying Bitcoin, and this could basically make Bitcoin just stay ahead of ETH. But that's not how I think this is going to play out. But it is something to consider, that maybe the ETF just keeps Bitcoin going versus ETH. I don't think that happens. I think that this is going to bottom out here. I don't know where it bottoms. I don't want to make that bet, but I think it will bottom, and I think ETH is going to have a massive run going into the going into 2024 throughout 2024, but especially early on, because I think after the ETF approval, it might not be a sell the news event, but I think people will start to speculate on an ETH ETF. And ETH has an upgrade, I believe somewhere around April, if I'm not mistaken, or sometime maybe quarter 2, which will significantly increase the efficiency of layer 2s. And you also have EigenLayer, which is a ETH restaking data availability project. And this is really important, I think, because that's going to benefit ETH tremendously. And I think that there will be a narrative with ETH, and I think this is actually going to outperform Bitcoin. Now, when does that happen? I'm not really sure, but I think it could be as early as this month. We shall see. I want to finish off this video talking about Solana. So if you remember some of the videos we made a long time ago, we had been talking about Solana when it was down here. And right now, Solana is quite a bit higher, but I still think that this is very early on Solana, believe it or not. I think that this is the best trade for 2024 for most people, because I think that it's still small enough to where you can get tremendous gains, but it isn't so speculative to where something could significantly go wrong, like a lot of the other altcoins. I know we can talk about really how this matches up with ETH, because I think when you compare it to ETH, that's how you kind of know this is still a really good opportunity. So its market cap is roughly 45 billion, okay? And if you look at Ethereum's, its market cap is about 275 billion. So this thing is significantly smaller than Ethereum. Yet, if you've used Solana recently, you'll know that it's a better experience. It's way faster, way cheaper, even cheaper than the layer 2s, and it has all of the applications that you would want to use. Borrowing and lending, swapping, staking, these are like kind of the pillars, right, of DeFi. You can do it all on Solana. Now, those applications might not be as trusted necessarily as the ETH blue chips, but I really enjoy using them. I prefer to use Solana, to be honest. And this is coming from someone that has, I was very biased towards ETH, okay? And it was a shocker to me, to be honest, how great the experience is on Solana, on these applications. So I think, look, it's got a $40 billion market cap. If it just catches up with ETH, you're talking about significant upside, right? If this thing ends up, let's say this thing is the size of where ETH peaked out at last cycle. That's a huge move from here. That's like a 10x. And what happens if you actually have institutional adoption into these layer 1s at the same time? Well, then they might go even further than, Solana could go a lot further than where ETH topped out last cycle. This is speculation, but what I'm saying is it clearly is well suited to, I think, at least double, triple, quadruple pretty quickly, assuming that we're in this global liquidity cycle to the upside, and we're having a disinflationary, we're in a disinflationary environment, meaning when I'm talking about CPI coming down, and there's an appetite for risk. All of those things are satisfied right now. So we're in a global risk on cycle. It's an election year. There's a huge list of reasons why I think risk assets in general are going to do well. So these are like the kind of assets that I really want to look at. Things that are undervalued versus a competitor, and it's actually like better than the competitor. That's just, to me, that it's asymmetrical opportunity. And you can see this with Sol ETH. So this is Sol versus ETH, and it is nearing all-time high here, but I think this is just going to keep going. Again, even in an environment where the market doesn't, like Solana didn't go up versus the dollar, I think it would have went up versus ETH because it's 40 billion, ETH is 275 billion. They both have this, I mean, the experience is better on Solana than it is on Ethereum. And we can argue about whether or not Solana is going to be able to grow significantly if ETH has all these layer 2s that are being used. But I think actually that the layer 2s are not even close to being ready for mainstream adoption. All of them are still centralized, and even with these layer 2s, or even with the ETH upgrade, they're still not as cheap as Solana. So Solana has significant advantages during this institutional adoption cycle because it's ready. It's actually ready to go, and it's going to have its own upgrade this year as well. It's called Firedancer, and I mean, that should be a really bullish, narrative for it later. I think that's all I want to talk about today, guys. Until next time, happy hunting, friends.